Harmful effects of smoking. Okay, we're going to talk about secondhand smoke. Okay, and in general, when we're talking about secondhand smoke, we're talking about the non-smoker being exposed to smoke. So it's the secondary person, not the primary person or the person that's actually smoking, or the primary source of the smoke, I should say. So we have mainstream smoke. This smoke is associated with the smoke, that's being released by the active smoker. So the smoker inhales smoke into the lungs. Nicotine is absorbed through the lungs into the bloodstream. Smoke is exhaled. Okay. And the non-smoker is exposed to a portion of the smoke, that the active smoker exhaled, which still contains, some nicotine. Then we have secondhand smoke. This is the type of smoke that's produced when you have a cigarette or something left burning in an ashtray. Okay, now both of these types of smoke, mainstream smoke from an active smoker or side stream smoke from a cigarette that's left burning in an ashtray, both of these contain the same types of carcinogens and other harmful substances. But side stream smoke has more of those substances, okay? So when you have mainstream smoke, only a portion of the harmful substances are exposed to the non-smoker, because the smoker has already inhaled a portion of that. But if you have a cigarette left burning in an ashtray, then you have a greater number, okay, or higher concentration of those carcinogens and other harmful substances that the non-smoker is exposed to. So side stream smoke is considered to be potentially more harmful than mainstream smoke, because in mainstream smoke, again, the smoker has already inhaled a portion of those harmful substances. So they both contain the same types of harmful substances. They're just more in side stream smoke, because with mainstream smoke, the active smoker has already inhaled some portion of that. Okay. Smoking has harmful effects on reproduction. Um, a couple of these things are going to be related. In general, a woman who smokes during pregnancy um, is more likely to have a premature birth. Okay, those babies are more likely to be of lower birth weight. And they're thinking, or one of the theories is that lower birth weight may be due to decreased amount of weight that's gained by the mother during the pregnancy, or due to reduced amounts of oxygen and other things that are necessary for the proper development of the fetus. And so those things are all related: premature birth, lower birth weight, and less oxygen being delivered to the developing fetus. Okay. In children that are born to mothers who smoke during the pregnancy, there are some correlations. Okay, remember, correlation does not mean causation, but there are some very significant correlations between spelling and reading scores, between attention spans, hyperactivity, and the mother's smoking status. So, for example, if you were to have a child tested for ADD, ADHD nowadays, one of the questions that's almost always asked is whether or not the mother smoked during pregnancy. Okay, and so I'm careful to say that these are just very high correlations, because you would have to have a complete history of everything else that may or may not have occurred during the pregnancy. But we do know that there's a very high correlation between the mother's smoking status and the incidence of, or the presence of hyperactivity, these reduced attention spans, etc. Okay, there's also evidence that smoking can have an effect on fertility. It can make it more difficult for a female to actually get pregnant. Okay, Um, and it can, and so therefore, excuse me, contribute to infertility. Okay, so those effects in terms of fertility most often seen, with female smokers. So as far as we know, not a lot of evidence on how smoking might affect, you know, any fertility related issues in males. Okay. Ah, so some of these are a little bit evident when we think about the relationship between smoking and lung disease. Okay. Um, so here, when I talk about lung disease, I'm not even referring to lung cancer yet. Okay. So ordinarily, we have a few processes that help our lungs remove uh, dust, dirt, particles, things that are too large to be absorbed through the membranes of the lung into the bloodstream. We have little cilia or little hairs that beat back and forth, and in concert with the production of mucus or phlegm, those little cilia beat back and forth, and then we have that urge to cough. And usually, in that mucus and phlegm, are the phlegm, and those things are, of course, are too large. That stuff is too big to pass through membranes. But any dirt and particles and things like that would also be contained in that phlegm or mucus that a person uh, coughs up. Okay, and so oftentimes, a person may have a discolored phlegm or mucus because there's an infection, or there are foreign substances that are present. Okay, so ordinarily you have these little cilia or hairs that beat back and forth that help to remove the particles, remove particles that are too large to be absorbed through the membranes from the lungs. And then we have process of phagocytosis. So we have little Pac-Men. Okay, you have these cells, and their job is to actually eat up or destroy foreign particles that are in the lungs. Okay, so you got phagocytosis, and you've got these little cilia, these little hairs that beat back and forth that help to remove foreign particles from the lungs. Now, in an individual that smoke, what happens eventually over time is that those processes become less effective because of the smoke and the constant presence of the smoke, the ash being deposited in the lungs. So when the little Pac-Men are no longer able to remove those, when the cilia aren't able to beat and force the ash and so forth out of the lungs, then you get a buildup of that ash in the lungs. And so this is where you hear the term black lungs, that smokers' lungs are often discolored because of the buildup of ash in the lungs. And you hear that term also being associated with individuals that work in places like coal mines, that over time, when they're inhaling these large particles, these large dust particles and contaminants in mines, then what happens is that those cilia no longer beat effectively to get rid of the dirt and the other contaminants, and the phagocytotic process doesn't work anymore. And so those coal miners and folks that work in mines end up with the buildup of dirt, particles, foreign substances in the lungs, and that's where you get that term black lung. Okay. Smoking also contributes to cancers of the mouth, the lungs, and the bladder. Remember, we talked about the fact that when cigarette smoke is burned, it produces, cigarette tobacco, excuse me, is burned, it produces an acidic smoke. That acidic smoke lowers the pH of the mouth, which causes nicotine, which is a weak base, to ionize. Okay. And so you get nicotine that gets trapped in the salivary glands of the mouth. And so you have often long-term exposure to high concentrations of nicotine in the mouth. Okay. As a result of continuing to smoke, and the fact that nicotine becomes ionized and gets trapped in the mucous membranes of the mouth. Okay. Now, even with a cigar smoker where nicotine can be absorbed through the membranes of the mouth, uh, you still have that exposure to the nicotine. Okay, you have that in the lungs, and then of course when we think about the bladder and we think about stressful situations, um, and so forth, that you have this exposure to high levels of nicotine. Same thing if we're talking about chewing tobacco, snuff, things like that. So you're at a greater risk for cancers of the mouth, lungs, and bladder. The other thing is that if you are a smoker, then you have a higher susceptibility to damage that can be caused by other carcinogens, by asbestos and other chemicals that might put you at greater risk for lung cancers. Alcohol, high levels of alcohol is associated with different types of cancers of the stomach and so forth. And so if you smoke, then it just increases your risk of cancers that are caused by other cancer causing agents. Okay, and forgive me, I'll go back for just a second. I made the assumption that everyone understands what a carcinogen is. A carcinogen is a cancer causing agent. There are some chemicals and substances that increase the likelihood of cancer. Okay, and then cancer is the abnormal growth of cells. So it's not like you touch a surface and you have cancer. Ordinarily, our bodies have processes that tell cells when to live and when to die. And what cancer is that those mechanisms are not in place, and so cells grow abnormally and end up taking over things. Or when we talk about exposure, in the mouth to high levels of nicotine, or exposure to high levels of alcohol. Okay, when cells in our bodies are dividing and replicating and so forth, ordinarily there's a proofreading uh, process where they go back and they check the work. Okay, what large amounts of many drugs do is interfere with that process, and so you end up with errors that don't get corrected, and things end up growing out of control. Okay, all right, so finally let's talk, we'll just revisit these because we've talked about nicotine replacement theories at the beginning of the chapter when we talked about other forms of nicotine administration. So again, briefly, the nicotine patch. Remember, this is a patch that's usually placed on the arm. The nicotine is in that, is incorporated into that matrix. It's absorbed through the various membranes of the skin and into the bloodstream. Blood levels rise over a period of time. And then when they start to fall, that's when it's time to change the patch. Okay. Then you have nicotine gum. Okay. Nicotine gum, remember, produces patterns in terms of rises and falls in nicotine levels that you would see with the cigarette, because as the nicotine in the gum, the nicotine they're getting from the gum wears off, the individual's going to chew another piece of gum. Similarly, if a person is smoking, that nicotine wears off, they smoke another cigarette. Okay, then we have the nasal spray. Okay, remember that's sprayed like any other nasal spray. The nicotine gets absorbed through the mucous membranes of the nose. Remember, this replacement therapy produces levels of nicotine that are more similar to smoking a cigarette. Okay, and then you have a nicotine immunization. Okay, this is one that, as far as I know, is not yet available. This has been under development for quite a while now. And the last update I heard, I think it was in some preliminary clinical trials. Okay, and so this is a very different concept, because some of the other available, which I don't have listed here, but you have Chantix, which is not a nicotine immunization. What Chantix does is blocks the receptors so that nicotine cannot produce its reinforcing effects. Okay, But this TOD-NIC, this nicotine immunization that's under development, would actually stimulate the body to produce antibodies against nicotine. So it would actually attack the nicotine molecules if the smoker smoked. And so that is a very, it's a very different replacement therapy in terms of what is currently available. And so, like I said, you have things like Chantix that are out there, but they block the receptors so that nicotine isn't able to produce its reinforcing effects. Okay, and Chantix has its issues because in some individuals it increases suicidal thoughts. And so forth. And so some people have had great success with it. For some people, it's literally been a nightmare because of some of the issues that come about with its use. And I would say that probably overall these replacement therapies have varying degrees of success. Probably a lot of it depends on the individual. With the compliance, I personally know some individuals who have chewed nicotine gum for years, and so they've quit smoking, but they haven't quit the nicotine habit. So it all depends on what the smoker's goal is, because of course, nicotine is what is most reinforcing, but we know that there's some other reinforcing properties um, when we think back to the dual reinforcement theory. Um, but for some individuals, it's a matter of eliminating all of the other harmful substances that are activated, the carcinogens, the toxins, the tar, um, that are associated with actually smoking cigarettes. And at some point I need to update these slides because I have not talked about the the vapor cigarettes. Those are not as safe as people think. Um, and that is because you have a lot of chemicals that are added to them to produce the different flavors, etc., that when heated and vaporized are not safe. And so I think we're going to see some more scrutiny, some additional examination of some of the e-cigs and the vapor cigarettes, especially the flavor, quote unquote, flavored ones that are out there in terms of their actual safety. Okay. Now, in terms of nicotine withdrawal, the interesting thing is that nicotine withdrawal uh, does not seem to be related uh, to the level of use. So a really heavy smoker isn't necessarily going to have more severe withdrawal symptoms than a light smoker. Okay, we know from reports that when an individual tries to quit smoking, or if they have a period of time where they're unable to smoke, that you've been sitting in a meeting all day and it's a non-smoking campus that you're on, for example, that withdrawal can be a stressful experience for the smoker. That they can be very agitated, just a very stressful period. And one of the things that I wanted to mention on the previous slide when I was talking about the success of various replacement therapies, stress is also a major player in relapse in terms of individuals that are trying to stop smoking. So sometimes individuals are trying to stop smoking, they're doing very well, and then, something very stressful happens that just throws them off and they begin to smoke again. Okay. Um, there are some effects of uh, withdrawal on heart rate and eating. Um, I don't think I ever really asked you about the heart rate thing. I'm not sure your textbook even continues to continue to talk about that. So let's not talk about the heart rate actually. Um, some individuals say that smoking or quitting smoking increases eating. And so sometimes the fear of gaining weight is a big concern for individuals when they are trying to stop smoking. Okay, but that doesn't mean that every individual who quits smoking is going to gain weight. That's going to vary from individual to individual. Concentration seems to be affected. Individuals who are trying to quit smoking say that they cannot concentrate. Some individuals have disturbed sleep. Of course, you're going to have cravings for nicotine. And then, because this is stressful, it's going to affect mood, where individuals are very moody, they can be agitated, etc. Okay? So, one of the things, other than heart rate, which I didn't talk about, well, you'll notice that most of these withdrawal symptoms are very subjective in nature. And this is why, a lot of individuals consider that nicotine addiction is primarily, one that's related to psychological dependence rather than physical dependence, because a lot of the withdrawal symptoms, or the symptoms that appear when the doses are reduced or you stop taking the drug, most of those symptoms are in fact subjective in nature. Okay?